The technical challenges, they're all solvable, even for people who weren't in the cloud already, weren't able to, access their material remotely. All of that stuff is solvable. But what's really tough is, having kids at home.
Mm-hmm.
Your colleague Derek was saying that his productivity is down 30%, and it's not because of a technology problem. It's because you've got a kid that you care about, and you're trying to keep them not just safe, but hopefully happy and moving forward developmentally.
I'm Jack Newton, CEO of Clio, and this is the Daily Matters podcast. On Daily Matters, we talk with legal professionals, industry leaders, and subject matter experts about the future of law. We explore where the legal industry is headed, how legal practice is changing, and what you can be doing to position yourself for success. Today, we're speaking to Greg McLawsen, the founder and managing attorney of Sound Immigration and a prolific world traveler. Greg, thanks for joining us today.
Good to see you again, Jack.
It's great to see you too. So, Greg, I'd like to start off just getting your perspective. What is on your mind most right now?
So here's what I would say. It's not the practice of law. Down here in the States, we've got 122,000 people dead. We've got a cultural moment here in 2020, which for some unknowable reason has to be a moment of reckoning where we're deciding if Black Americans deserve to be safe in their bodies.
Right.
I've got medically vulnerable family members who are, one stupid trip away from the grocery store, away from, potentially the end of their lives. I've got a 5-year-old who hasn't seen his friends in 4 months. And so, the time I spend in the day writing briefs is like, that's nothing. That's blissful escapism. I and your other attorney listeners, we know how to practice law. So the time spent doing that is the easiest, most blissful part of existence.
Right. It's your escape from the grim realities that are outside.
Yeah. I even feel guilty, the time that I'm spending doing motion practice in federal court while my wife is out there trying to keep the 2 kids from grabbing knives and getting their fingers off, that it feels guilty to be spending that time. So,
and Greg, tell us a bit more about your context right now. Where are you situated? What else is going on? And maybe while you're answering that question, just tell us a little bit more about your practice and how you typically operate.
So I live in in Bellevue, Washington, which is across Lake Washington from Seattle and the Seattle and the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone these days.
Right.
I run a decentralized immigration practice and have for about a decade now. And we have a couple different digital storefronts. We do family-based immigration, and then my personal practice focuses on a very niche type of federal litigation to enforce a type of financial contract.
Sorry, go ahead, Greg.
We've been decentralized well before COVID. So honestly, when the shutdown happened here in Washington State, it was really a couple weeks after that before I even really thought, God, is there anything we should be doing differently? Because everything was set up to be doing that anyway.
Right. And Greg, you're someone who I think has, been embracing and benefiting from the cloud for years, and now obviously COVID-19 has foisted so many law firms into the cloud, whether they wanted to be there or not. It's kind of the only way you can operate effectively right now. But your comment is interesting. You actually found that you really didn't have to change anything about the way you were operating when COVID hit.
Yeah, so the very first legal conference I ever went to out in Ocean Shores in Washington State was right after I had wrapped up a judicial clerkship. And I was so broke, I slept in a tent in a park close to the conference, and ran into a couple sales guys from this goofy startup called Clio up in BC. And the rest is history. So yeah, we've been on the relatively ground floor of that since the beginning.
And tell us a little bit more about how you operated pre-COVID-19. You individually, at least, Greg. I know you would find ways to run your law firm from around the world. You would travel for, in some cases, months at a time to some pretty far-flung places and not miss a beat as it related to running your law practice.
Yeah, so there's some flotsam up on the wall here. This is stuff from Bhutan, where we've been a couple times over the past few years. I was supposed to be in the Faroe Islands, which some listeners might not have heard of, but it's roughly between Denmark and Iceland, a little bit to the north. Um, but yeah, we've from a functional operational standpoint, it doesn't really make a difference to me where I am, with the exception of having to set conference calls at obnoxious times.
Uh, well, let's shift to your practice area for a few moments and some of the events that are happening on the ground. It's been a busy week as it relates to immigration. Last week there was a historic decision from the Supreme Court. I think what some regarded as a pretty surprising decision from some of the more conservative judges on the deferred action for childhood arrivals policy. Just yesterday, we had some news around H-1B visas and so on. Can you tell us specifically about DACA, what that decision means to you?
Yeah, I mean, there has been so much happening that when Derek was talking to me about today's podcast, I thought, okay, I really need to stop and just make sure I haven't missed something so major that I'm going to be embarrassed to have, had it fall beside under my attention. So DACA is something that has been on the forefront of immigration policy since before I practiced immigration law. And for especially your listeners who aren't here in the States, the question is basically this. We have well over 1 million youth who came to the United States as minor children, were brought by their parents. And what should we do with them? They lack immigration status. Should we have them, give them some form of pathway either to citizenship or to another legal status? Because prior to DACA, they had no way to work, no way to go to school because they couldn't get financial aid. So President Obama had put into effect a program called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, which didn't technically give them a legal status, but basically said, hey, we promise not to deport you. And since you're here and you're not going anywhere, we'll give you a temporary way to work legally. The Trump administration abruptly shut that down, and shut it down so abruptly and so capriciously that the Supreme Court, in a decision that caught me and my colleagues completely by surprise, said no, that you did that in such a mindless way that it's illegal. So now DACA is back into effect. We have our 700 plus thousand people who are on the program now able to continue, and the additional people who aren't already enrolled can apply. So that's a wild cultural moment to have in an otherwise time when immigration policy is being ratcheted down very, very aggressively by the administration.
And on the ground, what impacts is that decision going to have on your clients and your practice as a whole, Greg?
It's a good question. When DACA came around the first time, we believe that most, but not all people who qualified did apply for it. So those folks were already there. And those who will be most impacted will be those who didn't apply the first time around. And we've seen some of those folks come out of the shadows, and some folks who are already in DACA contacting us to talk about additional legal strategies they might have based on marriages to US citizens. But what makes this not perhaps quite as exciting as it might otherwise be is that the administration can, of course, reverse courses now, or double down on their position to begin with, and go back and axe DACA, do away with DACA through the appropriate procedural channels under the Administrative Procedures Act, which they doubtlessly will try to do, although it's not clear they'll be able to do that before the November election. So it really comes down to what happens in November, whether these folks have a continued way to stay in status.
And beyond November, is there a way to talk about what some of the longer term implications of the Supreme Court decision will be, or will that really hinge on what happens with the election?
It hinges in November. If the current administration stays here, DACA will be gone sooner or later. If the administration leaves, DACA will remain a thing, and potentially be replaced by legislation that codifies the same policy long term. So these folks who spent their whole lives just up in legal jeopardy are still back to being in legal jeopardy. That's what the
right, right. So, Greg, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the impacts of COVID-19. One of the, we launched this podcast wanting to talk to attorneys that were directly impacted by COVID-19 and talk about how they pivoted their practices in response to COVID-19. And you're actually the first conversation we've had in a few weeks that is doing a bit of a pulse check in terms of how you're adapting and what this new normal looks like for you. You answered part of this question already, just in terms of from a technology standpoint, you didn't have to make any huge pivots, but can you in a more broad way answer the question, how has your practice been impacted by COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is really personal. It's personal to me, and I observe it in my colleagues as well, that the technical challenges, they're all solvable, even for people who weren't in the cloud already, weren't able to access their material remotely. All of that stuff is solvable. But what's really tough is having kids at home. Your colleague Derek was saying that his productivity is down 30%, and it's not because of a technology problem. It's because you've got a kid that you care about, and you're trying to keep them not just safe, but hopefully happy and moving forward developmentally.
Yeah.
So it's all of those, and it's all of those things that are the most important to me and the most important to other attorneys, in their personal lives. That's what's tough, is trying to make sure that you're doing well by your family, making sure that you're, in this situation in the United States, trying to contribute to the political and cultural moment we're in, to be present for that, and then to try to go off and practice law. That's right. That's the tough part.
And as you mentioned earlier, going off and practicing law can feel like an escape relative to everything else that the backdrop of the headlines today is creating for us.
Honest to God, I feel guilty doing it. I feel guilty, with the time that I spend with my nose in my laptop.
So how have your clients been impacted by COVID-19 and even new business for you? It feels like so much around immigration, I would expect, has ground to a halt, or something close to a halt over the course of COVID-19. You see lots of border closures. Even the largest unprotected land border in the world, which is the Canada-US border that separates you and I just by a couple hundred miles, has been closed for close to 3 months now. And they just announced it will remain closed until mid-July at the earliest. What's the impact been to your clients and to your new business as well?
So let me give the Mr. Rogers answer, and then I'll give the lawyer answer. I mean, so the Mr. Rogers answer is, I observe the same type of personal stress in my clients that I'm experiencing.
Right.
And so we'll get really angry emails or really angst-driven emails over just nothing.
Right.
Just a total non-event. And so I've tried to be a little Mr. Rogers about responding to the feelings that people are displaying, rather than the total non-legal concern.
Yeah.
That I had a PhD client who I absolutely loved to death in Nebraska, who was just really, really, really concerned about this filing we were making, and was it going to be fine? Was it going to be fine? I just finally had to grab him by the shoulders and say, "Look, you are fine. You're experiencing a lot of stress with your kids, but your legal situation is fine." So that's the Mr. Rogers answer. From a business, we're actually busier than we were pre-COVID.
Wow.
And that's probably partially because we were set up to provide services that other firms weren't able to provide. But then you also have situations where folks are trapped here in the United States. So, for example, I can think of a Thai client who's over in the Midwest who can't go back to Thailand because the kingdom had travel restrictions put into place. Mm-hmm. And so she was planning to do a marriage-based visa in Thailand to return here to the States, but now she's stuck. So, right. We're processing her case stateside. And there are a lot of folks in that situation. So, we're busy right now. We really are.
Your Mr. Rogers answer, although it was joking, I loved it though, because I think it highlights how, some empathy for the situation your clients are in is so important. Everyone is in this heightened emotional state, and the smallest issues can tip over into an explosion of emotions. And I think just appreciating how tightly wound people are right now, and as a lawyer and this hugely impactful individual in so many people's lives, that being that calming force is I think actually a really important message, and obviously a very deliberate mindset that you're approaching your interactions with.
And we have it relatively easy in that regard. I would think family law attorneys should really be dialing up that counselor mentality, because you're having people making really impactful life decisions at a time when you really should not be making big life decisions.
Yes, certainly suboptimal conditions to make those big life decisions. And beyond your practice, can you talk about just some of the broader impacts on immigration law that COVID-19 has had? And you wrote a great blog post, and we'll make sure a link to that's in the show notes for anyone that wants to read up on it. But you rounded up what you described as a buffet of immigration issues that have emerged as a result of COVID-19. Can you walk us through what some of those issues are?
Yeah, and I'm cognizant of not wanting to make this a political discussion, which is really tough because immigration is a political football here south of the border. So try to choose my words carefully here. Any way you look at it, the administration has greatly ratcheted down on immigration during the crisis. Yeah. So what we saw most recently, just yesterday, was a total 100% almost, a total ban on temporary visas for workers in the US. So I don't know if this might resonate to you, Jack, as somebody who runs a technology company, but here in the States, I'm just a few miles away from Google and Microsoft, and they can now effectively no longer secure any foreign workers for their workforce.
Yeah.
Which is insane. It's insane. We're
hugely in demand and hard to find roles in these companies as well.
Holy Toledo, we've got a knowledge-based economy here in the Seattle area, and as a country in large measure, that can now no longer secure knowledge workers.
Yeah. And just in response to that, Greg, we sometimes jokingly refer to Vancouver as the H-1B holding pen, essentially, for the U.S. We have a huge number of U.S. tech companies that have satellite offices in Vancouver and Canada more broadly, where these not temporary workers, but the H-1B certified folks, while they're waiting for their visa to come through, will work in Vancouver. And for many, what was meant to be a temporary situation has turned into a permanent one. And it's actually, oddly enough, turned into be a bit of a boon for Canada's tech sector, because all of these H-1B workers that can't get into the US are putting down roots in Canada. And these are enormously talented folks that are the engine of the economy of the future. And as you pointed out, it's a knowledge economy, and they help local workers create a really compelling future. And it's oddly enough become this this almost competitive advantage for, for Canada as the U.S. has become even more restrictive on H-1B visas.
I am well aware, and to the extent that a race car is driving to Vancouver, we just hit the nitros on that and
right
gave you guys a massive infusion of additional, really well-paying jobs, and everything that comes along with that, all of that money that those families are going to be spending and the contributions they're going to be making, it's going to be for y'all. So you're welcome. Enjoy.
Thank you. Beyond H-1B, what are some of the other issues in this buffet of immigration issues you think are worth touching on?
I mean, everything is stopped in terms of international mobility right now. So folks who are here in the United States, to some measure, can pursue legal avenues. But if you're outside of the States, the U.S. Department of State, which handles our visa issuance at consulates abroad, it's just closed. You're not moving anywhere. And there are very, very limited exceptions for emergency situations, but effectively things are shut down. And it's very unclear when that's going to thaw, because when I talk to our clients, I treat any forecasts by the Department of State or anybody else as an absolute fiction right now, because the reality is that it's just going to turn on the situation on the ground, both here in the United States and whatever the forum country is. And those are just unknown unknowns. We don't know what's going to happen here in the States, and we don't know what's going to happen at any given country. So, when the consulate in Islamabad is going to be back to normal is just not knowable right now.
Looking at both yourself and immigration lawyers that as a whole, Greg, what are some of the more innovative ways that you've seen the immigration lawyers pivot to the new realities that COVID-19 presents?
Well, I mean, there have been some really compelling forms of advocacy just to pitch in for people who are most negatively impacted. So just one example of that would be attorneys who are filing habeas corpus lawsuits to challenge unsafe detention practices by folks who are not criminals and being held on administrative charges in really crowded facilities and facing a life or death crisis. Attorneys have been challenging those detentions with mixed results, but they have gotten people out of situations that could have cost them their lives. So, that's not a moneymaker, but it's a compelling thing to see, for sure.
Absolutely.
I get the sense, though, that there are a lot of practices that are really hurting right now. I think lawyers have pretty thick skin, and they're not generally ones to cry for help, but I think a lot of people are really hurting out there and haven't found a way to adapt.
Greg, I'm also curious, how do you see COVID-19 having a longer term impact on immigration? Do you think we're obviously seeing a lot of short-term impacts as a result of the current administration. Do you think it's mainly a function of the administration, or do you see COVID-19 really driving a permanent shift in policymakers as it relates to immigration?
My best guess is that it catalyzes the discussion, and rather than pushing it in a particular direction, will just kind of harden the already existing divisions that exist in politics here in the United States. So I think the hardliners who see immigration as a detriment to the U.S. are just doubling down on that position, and those who think that our entire economy really deeply depends on it are going to stand by that position. So it's just one more thing, and there are a lot of them that are really pushing us in a polarizing direction this year.
Right. And it was already a polarizing topic. So we're just seeing it, that spectrum get wider.
Yeah, the inverted bell curve just kind of pushes up.
All right. Well, let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the client experience to conclude our discussion, Greg. you were our very first guest on our very first episode of Clio's first ever podcast, the Matters podcast. And in that very first episode of Matters, you discussed how your firm prioritized client experience. And that's a topic that's near and dear to my heart as well. And I'm curious, how has your perspective on what the client experience looks like and what being a client-centered law firm looks like in light of the COVID-19 crisis?
I mean, I will never treat this moment as a opportunity to celebrate something. But I think it's fair to observe that a lot of my colleagues think that what we do here is something, a little bit crazy to think that people are willing to deal with an attorney in a digital environment. That why would you ever want to meet with an attorney online if you can meet with them in person? Well, guess what? Now it's the only option. So I was already of the view that people, I was betting my practice on the view that people were willing and in fact wanted to do that. But now that we're in an environment where there's no other option, it normalizes what we did in a way that I think long-term will change people's expectations about how it's comfortable and helpful to do business. So my guess is that when we go back to normal, whenever in the world that is, that a lot of the folks who were forced into dealing with an attorney on Zoom will now say, well, why would I ever want to drive across town to do something that I can do in my pajamas in the living room?
Yeah. And in fact, we're seeing some early signs of that in the data that we just published this week at Clio, the COVID-19 briefing that outlines some of the consumer research that we've done on this topic supports exactly what you just said, Greg, which is consumers are, number one, more facile than ever when it comes to using video conferencing solutions and Zoom in particular. And that they actually prefer a Zoom meeting over a phone call or over an in-person meeting. And to your point, when you compare the convenience of a Zoom call and all the benefits that I think consumers thought they were looking for in an in-person meeting, they get probably 95% of that out of the Zoom call, with all of the convenience of a phone call in terms of not having to commute, not having to dress up, not having to put on pants. All of those things are actually real benefits when it comes to accessibility for a lot of folks. Yeah. Can you also, maybe speak to how you're thinking about the way that COVID-19 might impact the industry in terms of this more broad-based adoption of remote work? You talked a little bit about shifting client expectations, but in some of the conversations I've had with attorneys that have been forced into this distributed work from home environment, they've been surprised at how well it's worked, not only for them, but across their firm, and the new tools that are available to run a distributed law office or distributed business of any kind are better than they've ever been. And do you think this will be a lasting change for law firms that embrace this completely new world? Or do you think we'll see a pivot, the pendulum swing right back to expensive downtown office space and a more traditional work environment?
Yeah, I mean, this is not a cynical view, but I've learned never to underestimate the momentum of the way things have always been done in law. It is a battleship that turns awfully slow in my experience. So I bet it's right that we see some adoption of distributed work and maybe some, backsliding on the expensive downtown office space. But if this will not be a sea change, is my expectation, that things will return more or less to the way they were. And maybe there's in larger firms some adoption of, a little bit more flexibility in terms of work at home policy. But man, things change so slowly in this industry. I would be surprised if we see big changes.
So, and Greg, if you're looking at change in legal maybe as a more traditional technology diffusion curve where there's, early adopters and, eventually the early majority and the late majority that'll kind of join in on the party. If you're one of the law firms that it isn't necessarily an early adopter as you were of cloud technologies and distributed work and so on, but you're in that early majority that wants to lean into this and maybe rethink the way that you're delivering client experience and so on. What are some of the opportunities you see for those firms, and where would you send them if you were giving them a recommendation of tools, technologies, and resources to kind of lean into the type of practice that you've managed to build over the last few years?
So as somebody who did a little bit of mountaineering, I tend to look at that as a functional problem. I would break things down into systems, so just like you have your water system when you're climbing and your rope system, think about your firm in terms of systems. And if the goal is to have things distributed, break things into functional parts and solve for that. In ways that don't require them to be done in the way they've always been done. And that includes, practice area and practice subspecialty. So I was concerned kind of early in the crisis that the supply might just drop out of our traditional work. Thankfully it didn't. So I was thinking about minor practice area pivots we could make to doing work, for example, in litigation areas that involve attorney provisions against the government. So for example, could we switch to doing a lot of lawsuits under the Freedom of Information Act, which has an attorney fee provision if we prevail? Could we switch to doing mandamus actions to compel action in immigration cases that are paused? Because if we could do that, then maybe we could recover fees under the Equal Access to Justice Act. So that would be an example of minor practice area pivots that might, save a firm if your consumer base is dropped out.
All right, Greg. Well, let's wrap up on an optimistic note. You're known for being a prolific traveler. You've gone all over the world managing your firm remotely. When this is all over and behind us, where's the first place you're buying a ticket to?
So I already have a ticket to the Faroe Islands, and we'll put that back into place as soon as we can. But as soon as we get done with this call, I am hopping in my car with my wife to drive over to Fisherman's Terminal in Seattle to see if we can buy a boat to get out of Dodge. So I'm a human-powered watercraft guy. I never thought I would buy a power boat, but if it's the only way to get out of here with the family, then that's what we're going to do.
Well, like in Vancouver here, you've got some great exploring on the water open to you out of Seattle there.
That we do.
So Greg, we've had a pretty far-ranging discussion. I've really enjoyed it. If there's one thing you'd like our listeners to take away from this episode, what would that be?
I got to go back to Mr. Rogers on that, and just encourage all of us, and I'm talking to myself here, to be kind to ourselves and to be kind to others. It's a really tough time, and we got a lot of this ahead of us. We're not near the end, and everyone's hurting. Your listeners are hurting. So, let's try to, as best we can, muster whatever energy we have to be kind.
That's a great note to end on. And thanks so much for joining us, Greg. Some super useful perspectives over the course of our discussion, and good luck on your boat buying excursion.
Thanks. First world problems.
Thanks for joining us on Daily Matters, a podcast from Clio. Rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Daily Matters is produced by Andrew Booth, Sam Rosenthal, and Derek Boland, and hosted by yours truly, Jack Newton. Thanks also to Clio, the world's leading cloud-based legal technology provider, for supporting this podcast.